Welcome to Fear Files, where darkness lurks around every corner. Tonight, we dive into tales of terror that will chill you to your core. Imagine a lonely highway where a flickering motel promises both refuge and doom, or a mystical mansion that appears only under a blood moon, harboring secrets beyond comprehension. Join us as we unravel the mysteries of these haunted realms. Brace yourself, for what you're about to experience will haunt your dreams. Prepare to confront your deepest fears. The nightmarish journey begins now.
Jennifer Carter had always been skeptical of urban legends, but the sudden appearance of a house in the vacant lot across the street couldn't be ignored. She stood at the edge of her driveway, staring at the dark, imposing structure that had seemingly materialized overnight. The neighborhood buzzed with unease. Whispers of curses and ghost stories filled the air. Her journalist instincts kicked in, and Jennifer decided to investigate. With a deep breath, she crossed the street, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the early morning. The house loomed above her, its windows like dark eyes watching her approach. She pushed open the creaky door, and it swung inward, inviting her into its depths. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The foyer was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. As Jennifer stepped further inside, the door slammed shut behind her with a resounding thud, sealing her fate. Jennifer took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She ventured deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The house seemed to whisper around her, the creaks and groans of the old structure filling the silence. Jennifer's flashlight flickered as she navigated the winding corridors. Each door she opened revealed a different nightmare. In one room, she found herself standing in a dense forest, the trees closing in around her. She could hear whispers in the darkness, voices calling her name. Her heart pounded as she ran, only to find herself back in the house, the forest gone. In another room, she was plunged into icy water, struggling to stay afloat. Hands reached up from the depths, pulling her down. She thrashed and gasped for air, only to find herself lying on the cold floor, drenched but alive. Jennifer's heart raced as she lay on the cold floor, her clothes soaked through. She pushed herself up, her body trembling from the cold and fear. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out. The house seemed to shift around her, the corridors twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Jennifer wasn't alone in the house. She encountered other victims, each trapped in their own personal hell. There was Tom, a middle-aged man haunted by the loss of his family in a car accident. Sarah, a teenager who couldn't escape the bullying that had driven her to the brink of despair. Each had their own story, their own fears made manifest by the house. They formed an uneasy alliance, sharing their fears and pooling their knowledge in an attempt to find a way out. Jennifer's determination to uncover the truth about her brother's disappearance drove her to push forward, even as the house twisted and changed around them. The house seemed to sense Jennifer's resolve and began to target her specifically. She found herself in a room that mirrored her childhood home, her brother's laughter echoing through the halls. She followed the sound, finding a door that led to his bedroom. Inside, she saw her brother, pale and ghostly, sitting on the bed. He looked up at her with hollow eyes, and she felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had failed him. She had let him disappear. "Jennifer, why didn't you save me?" His voice was a whisper filled with pain. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, reaching out to him. But as she touched him, he dissolved into mist, leaving her alone in the room. The group discovered that the house's shifting nature was governed by a series of symbols and runes carved into the walls. Jennifer realized that these symbols corresponded to their fears, and deciphering them was the key to escaping. As they worked together to solve the puzzle, the house became increasingly hostile. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Time was running out. Jennifer pored over the symbols, her mind racing to make sense of them. The others watched her, their faces pale with fear. They trusted her, depended on her to lead them out. She couldn't let them down. With the final symbol decoded, a hidden door revealed itself. Beyond it lay the heart of the house, a room filled with a dark, pulsing energy. The entity that controlled the house stood before them, a twisted figure of shadow and malice. Jennifer stepped forward, her fear giving way to anger. "You've taken enough. You won't take any more." The entity laughed, a sound that echoed through the room. "You think you can defeat me? I am fear itself." Jennifer raised the flashlight, its beam piercing the darkness. The entity recoiled, and she realized that light and courage were its weaknesses. She stepped closer, the light growing brighter, the entity shrinking back. With a final determined push, Jennifer drove the entity back, the room collapsing around them. The house shuddered and groaned, its grip on reality weakening. She grabbed Tom and Sarah, pulling them through the door as the house began to implode. They stumbled out into the early morning light, the house vanishing behind them. Jennifer looked at her companions, their faces reflecting the same mixture of relief and exhaustion she felt. They had survived. They had escaped. In the days that followed, Jennifer began to piece together the mystery of the house. It had been a conduit for dark magic, feeding on the fears of those who entered. With its destruction, the neighborhood returned to its peaceful state, the odd occurrences ceasing. Jennifer found a measure of peace as well. She had faced her deepest fear and come out stronger. Though the guilt of her brother's disappearance still lingered, she knew she had done everything she could to uncover the truth. And in that, she found a sense of closure. The days after the escape were filled with restless sleep and unsettling dreams for Jennifer. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching her, that its malevolent presence lingered in the shadows of her mind. Every creak in her own home made her jump. Every dark corner seemed to hide a threat. One night, as she tossed and turned, she heard a faint whispering. Sitting up in bed, she strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, forming words she could barely comprehend. "Jennifer, come back." She shivered, her skin crawling. She knew she had to go back to the lot where the house had stood. She had to make sure it was truly gone. Jennifer stood at the edge of the vacant lot, now just an expanse of overgrown grass and weeds. There was no sign of the house, no indication it had ever existed. But the whispers persisted, growing louder in her mind. Determined to end the nightmare once and for all, she decided to dig. She borrowed a shovel from a neighbor and started to work, the ground giving way beneath her efforts. She dug for hours, sweat pouring down her face until she hit something hard. She knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal a large, ornate box. Her heart raced as she opened it, revealing a collection of ancient artifacts and a thick leather-bound journal. She took the journal, flipping through its pages, her eyes widening as she read. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Blackwood, a practitioner of dark magic who had built the house centuries ago. He had discovered a way to harness fear, using it to strengthen his powers. The house was his creation, a vessel to trap and consume souls. Jennifer's hands trembled as she read the final entries. Blackwood had failed in his last ritual, trapping himself within the house. His spirit had merged with the entity, feeding on the fear of those who entered. She knew now that destroying the house wasn't enough. She had to break the curse that bound Blackwood's spirit to this world. Jennifer contacted Tom and Sarah, explaining what she had found. They were reluctant at first, still traumatized by their experiences, but they knew they couldn't truly move on until the entity was defeated. They met at Jennifer's house, the journal spread out on the table before them. Together, they devised a plan to break the curse. They would need to gather specific ingredients for a ritual, items that represented the elements and their own personal fears. The night of the ritual, the air was thick with tension. They gathered in the vacant lot, forming a circle around the box of artifacts. Jennifer read aloud from the journal, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. As she spoke the incantation, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Shadows rose from the earth, forming into the twisted figure of Elias Blackwood. His eyes burned with fury, his voice a roar of hatred. "You dare challenge me?" he bellowed. Jennifer stood firm, the light of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "We're not afraid of you anymore." Blackwood lunged at them, his form shifting and changing, a mass of darkness and fear. Jennifer held the flashlight steady, its beam piercing through his form. Tom and Sarah added their voices to the incantation, their combined strength pushing back against the entity. The air crackled with energy, the ground shaking violently. Blackwood's screams echoed through the night, growing weaker with each passing moment. Jennifer felt a surge of power, the light from her flashlight growing brighter, enveloping the entity. With a final desperate cry, Blackwood's form shattered, the darkness dissipating into the night. The ground stilled, the air clearing. The curse was broken. The lot was silent, the night air cool and still. Jennifer, Tom, and Sarah stood in a daze, the reality of what they had done slowly sinking in. They had faced their fears, confronted the darkness, and emerged victorious. In the days that followed, the neighborhood returned to its peaceful state. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer seemed threatening. Jennifer felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She visited her brother's grave, placing a bouquet of flowers on the ground. "I did it, little brother. I found the truth." As she walked away, she felt a warmth in her heart, a quiet assurance that her brother was finally at peace. She had faced her fears, confronted the past, and found closure. The nightmares were over, and the future held a promise of healing and hope. Jennifer Carter had uncovered the truth, and in doing so, she had freed not only herself, but the souls trapped by the house's malevolent presence. The mysterious house was gone, but the lessons learned and the strength gained would remain with her forever. The night of the blood moon arrived with an eerie silence. Nathan Ward stood at the edge of the forest, staring at the blood-red orb hanging low in the sky. He had heard the rumors about Blackthorn Manor, but he had to see it for himself. With him were his friends Lena, Jason, and Emily, fellow urban explorers eager for a new adventure. They made their way through the dense forest, the light of the blood moon casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. After what felt like hours of trudging through the underbrush, they saw it. Blackthorn Manor, its dark silhouette looming against the crimson sky. The mansion looked untouched by time, its Gothic architecture both beautiful and foreboding. Nathan felt a chill run down his spine as they approached the massive front doors. With a deep breath, he pushed them open and the group stepped inside. The air inside the mansion was cold and stale, filled with the scent of decay. Nathan's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing dust-covered furniture and cobwebbed chandeliers. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they ventured deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine halls. Lena found an old painting of the Blackthorn family, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. Jason and Emily discovered a grand library, its shelves filled with ancient tomes and journals. Nathan, meanwhile, was drawn to a set of double doors at the end of the hallway. As he opened the doors, a wave of cold air rushed past him. The room beyond was a grand ballroom, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected their fearful faces. Nathan felt a sense of dread wash over him. Something was very wrong with this place. After hours of exploring, the group decided to leave. They retraced their steps to the front door, but when they opened it, they found themselves standing in the grand ballroom again. Panic set in as they tried every exit they could find, each one leading them back to the same room. "We're trapped," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Nathan refused to believe it. "There has to be a way out. We just haven't found it yet." Determined to find answers, they began to search the mansion for clues about its history. In the library, they discovered a journal belonging to Eliza Blackthorne, the last matriarch of the family. The entry spoke of strange rituals and a malevolent force that had taken over the mansion. Eliza wrote about the blood moon and how it brought the mansion to life, trapping those who entered. She described the entity, a dark presence that fed on fear and despair, growing stronger with each soul it claimed. As they read Eliza's journal, the mansion began to warp around them. The walls shifted, and the rooms twisted into nightmarish versions of themselves. Each member of the group was confronted with their deepest fears. Lena found herself in a dark room filled with spiders, their hairy legs crawling over her skin. Jason was trapped in a coffin, the air growing thin as he struggled to breathe. Emily saw the ghostly figure of her deceased sister, blaming her for her untimely death. Nathan was haunted by visions of his best friend, calling out to him from the darkness. "Why didn't you save me, Nathan? Why did you leave me?" Through the horrors, they realized that the only way to escape was to confront their fears and break the entity's hold on the mansion. They had to find the ritual Eliza described in her journal and perform it to banish the entity. They gathered the necessary items, a mirror, a candle, and a knife. As they prepared for the ritual, the mansion's attacks grew more vicious. Shadows lunged at them, whispers filled their minds, and the walls seemed to close in. In the grand ballroom, they set up the ritual. Nathan lit the candle, its flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. Lena held the mirror, reflecting their fearful faces. Jason and Emily stood ready with the knife, their hands trembling. Nathan began to recite the incantation from Eliza's journal, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. As he spoke, the entity appeared, a mass of shadows and malevolence. It roared in anger, the ground shaking beneath them. "You cannot banish me," the entity hissed. "I am eternal." The group stood their ground, their combined courage weakening the entity. Nathan continued the incantation, his voice growing stronger. The entity lashed out, but they held firm, the candle's flame burning brighter. With a final defiant cry, Nathan completed the ritual. The entity screamed, its form dissolving into darkness. The mansion shook violently, the walls cracking and splintering. The blood moon's light filled the room, blinding them. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in the forest, the mansion gone. The blood moon was high in the sky, casting its eerie light on the now empty clearing. They had escaped, but the experience had left them shaken. Nathan looked at his friends, their faces pale and exhausted. They had faced their fears and survived, but the memory of Blackthorn Manor would haunt them forever. In the days that followed, Nathan wrote about their experience, sharing the story of Blackthorn Manor with the world. His blog post went viral, drawing attention from paranormal investigators and thrill seekers alike. But Nathan knew that the true horror of the mansion could never be fully understood by those who hadn't experienced it firsthand. He visited the site of the mansion one last time, finding only an empty clearing where the manor once stood. As he looked up at the sky, the blood moon began to wane, its crimson light fading. Nathan felt a sense of closure, knowing that they had defeated the entity and freed the souls trapped within the mansion. But he also knew that the memory of Blackthorn Manor would stay with him forever, a reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows and the courage it takes to face them. Chris Turner had been driving for hours, the endless expanse of desert stretching out before him, marked only by the occasional tumbleweed and distant mountain ridge. The storm brewing on the horizon seemed to grow more menacing with every passing mile. As the wind howled and rain began to lash against his windshield, Chris noticed a flickering neon sign in the distance. The Mirage Motel, it read. It appeared and disappeared intermittently, as though it were a mirage itself. With no other shelter in sight and the storm worsening, Chris decided to pull in. The moment he stepped out of his car, the desert's oppressive heat was replaced by an unsettling chill. The motel's exterior was worn and neglected, its paint peeling and the neon sign sputtering erratically. The rain had turned to a heavy downpour, making the landscape outside seem a distorted blur. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The reception desk was empty, and the silence was punctuated only by the distant rumble of thunder. Chris approached the desk, but no one appeared to check him in. The key, a rusted and ancient-looking item, was left on the counter. With no other options and the storm raging outside, he took the key and ventured into the motel's labyrinthine corridors. As he walked, the hallways seemed to twist and elongate unnaturally. The light fixtures flickered sporadically, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. The rooms themselves were an unsettling patchwork of reality. Each door Chris opened revealed a different dimension, each more bizarre than the last. The first room he entered was a grotesque parody of a living space. The furniture was oddly distorted, and the walls seemed to breathe with a slow, rhythmic pulse. A dark, viscous substance seeped through the cracks in the walls and pooled on the floor. As Chris moved further into the room, he heard faint, disembodied whispers, words in a language he could not comprehend. The air grew thick and oppressive, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over him. Determined to find some semblance of normalcy, Chris explored further. He found himself in a room where gravity seemed optional. Objects floated around him, defying the natural laws he was accustomed to. He watched in disbelief as a clock on the wall spun wildly, its hands moving faster and faster until they were a blur. Time itself felt warped here, and Chris began to lose track of how long he had been wandering. In another room, he encountered mirrors that showed distorted reflections of his past. These mirrors did not merely reflect his image, but replayed moments of guilt and regret. Chris saw himself during the storm that had claimed the life of someone dear to him. The memory was haunting, and it felt as if the mirrors were taunting him with his failures. Each reflection seemed to mock him, amplifying his sense of guilt and helplessness. Chris found a journal in one of the rooms, its cover aged and cracked. The pages were filled with cryptic symbols and descriptions of rituals meant to unravel the motel's curse. As he read, he realized the motel was more than just a physical place. It was a nexus of dark energy, a gateway to a nightmarish realm where the laws of reality were bent to the will of a malevolent entity. The journal spoke of a ritual that could potentially break the curse, but it required specific items scattered throughout the motel. Chris's sense of urgency grew as he understood that survival depended on his ability to gather these items and perform the ritual. Each room he entered seemed more hostile and surreal than the last, and the entity's presence grew more oppressive. The entity itself was a dark, shifting force, an amorphous shadow that seemed to pervade every corner of the motel. It fed on Chris's fears and regrets, manipulating the space around him to intensify his terror. It whispered taunts, using his deepest anxieties against him. The entity thrived on chaos and suffering, making each attempt to escape feel like an exercise in futility. Chris faced spectral figures, lost souls trapped within the motel's warped dimensions. Their hollow eyes and tormented expressions conveyed their despair. Some tried to warn him, while others seemed to reach out for help, their cries echoing through the corridors. Chris realized these spirits were once victims of the motel's curse, now bound to its nightmarish realm. Their presence served as a grim reminder of what awaited him if he failed. As Chris navigated the motel's shifting realities, he had to confront his own inner demons. Each room seemed to force him to relive moments of his past, presenting his regrets and failures in increasingly grotesque forms. The motel itself appeared to be alive, its structure constantly changing to trap him and feed on his fear. The very walls seemed to close in on him, and the air grew thicker with each passing hour. In one particularly harrowing room, Chris encountered a hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls were covered in shifting, pulsating patterns that made it difficult to discern any fixed point. The air was filled with an eerie, low-frequency hum that seemed to disorient him further. Chris realized that the room was not just a physical trap, but a psychological one, designed to break his will and drive him to despair. Despite the increasing danger, Chris pressed on. He gathered the items required for the ritual, each one more elusive and perilous to obtain than the last. The motel's reality seemed to warp around him, the entity's influence growing stronger and more malevolent. The spirits of past victims continued to appear, their cries and whispers blending into a cacophony of anguish. Finally, Chris reached the room where the ritual was to be performed. The walls were lined with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. As he began to arrange the items according to the journal's instructions, the motel's reality began to collapse around him. The walls cracked and shattered, and the air grew thick with a swirling darkness. The entity roared in fury, its form shifting into a chaotic maelstrom of shadows and malevolent energy. Chris chanted the incantation, his voice trembling but resolute. The ritual required not only the items, but also the strength of his will to banish the entity and break the curse. The motel's structure continued to deteriorate, the darkness swirling around him as the entity fought against the ritual. Chris focused on the ritual's words, channeling his fear and guilt into a determination to escape. In a blinding flash of light, the entity was expelled, and the motel's dimensions began to unravel. The walls crumbled, and the entire structure seemed to implode under the weight of the dark energy that had once sustained it. Chris was thrown out into the desert, the storm clearing as dawn broke over the horizon. The Mirage Motel was gone, reduced to nothing more than a distant memory and a few scattered ruins. Chris felt a profound sense of relief and closure as he stood in the quiet desert, the horrors of the motel fading into the past. He returned to his apartment, where the journal had mysteriously disappeared, leaving no trace of its existence. Chris's life began to heal, and he channeled his experiences into his writing. His stories, inspired by the nightmares of the Mirage Motel, found an audience and brought him a renewed sense of purpose. Though the motel was gone, its legacy lived on in Chris's tales and in the hearts of those who read them. The echoes of the past would never fully disappear, but Chris had learned to live with them. The desert was quiet once more, and as Chris looked out over the vast expanse of sand, he knew he would never forget the horrors of the Mirage Motel. It was a reminder of the darkness lurking just beyond the edge of reality and the strength required to confront it.
Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the unknown. If you found yourself gripped by the terror of tonight's tales, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Fear Files. Share your thoughts and fears in the comments below. Your stories might just inspire our next haunting adventure. Until next time, keep your lights on and your courage close, because the darkness is never too far away. Sleep tight if you can.